Olof, I wanted to take the time to interact with and provide a refutation of your video critiquing my presentation called The Kalam Cosmological Argument Can Now Be Directly Refuted. The first segment of your response I want to deal with is your attempt to create a formulation of the Kalam that does not assume a specific view of time. I found your argument to be sheer folly since you spent approximately, not exactly, but approximately 13 minutes of the video trying to close that option against the Kalam, and simply wasted the approximate 13 minutes since your argument ignored what I had already said in my video to begin with, which is that on a B theory of time, nothing ever begins to exist or comes into existence. So with that in mind, when we look at your argument, we can see it's just nonsense, because the first premise does not work on a B theory of time. On the B theory, there is no temporal becoming. On the B theory, nothing ever comes into existence, including contingent entities, so they don't require nor have a cause. There are other fatal problems with your attempt at a time-neutral formulation of the Kalam, like premise 2, where you try to extrapolate past incompleteness to the universe as a whole, which is fallacious as it presupposes a certain definition of the universe that not everyone might hold to, and is erroneous since geodesic incompleteness would not apply to the quantum vacuum given its lack of edge or boundary. But I can't be bothered to get into depth on that since I am not a B theorist to time. I am an A theorist and relationist to time, so your argument there is not that important to me. The second segment of your response I want to address is the one where you tackle my refutation of the Kalam based on the philosophical position that the universe is the totality of existence. I was very disappointed with your response here. It was very unfortunate that you decided to resort to childish mockery and arrogant disrespect. That you actually took the time to go and find clips of Captain Jean-Luc Picard facepalming was pathetic and completely uncalled for, given how respectful and civil my response to you was. Your response here was actually so bad that in my view it rose to the level of folly. You engaged in childish and uncalled for mockery with the Jean-Luc Picard clips. Then shortly after that you were dishonest, as you dishonestly misrepresented me. In that point I made, I did not a single time mention the word physicalism. Yet you said, quote, "You're saying that an argument against physicalism is false because physicalism is true," which is dishonest on your part since I did not say that, and did not even mention the word physicalism. Consistent with objectivism, the totality of existence does not make a dichotomy between physical and non-physical. It only makes a distinction on that position between existence and non-existence. Your response in that segment was also folly because you displayed hypocrisy. You wrote a text saying, quote, "You're using your philosophy to argue against a conclusion that is not compatible with your philosophy. How circular can it get?" Unquote. That was a laughably bad response considering that you spent around 13 minutes arguing against the B theory of time, which is, wait for it, a philosophy of time. So one philosophy you take seriously enough to spend around 13 minutes arguing against. But when a person uses some other philosophy that presumably you don't respect, that requires no argument against it, but simply clips you use to childishly mock it, dishonesty, and worthless claims of circularity. Where are your claims about circularity with the B theory of time, which is itself a philosophy that is not compatible with the conclusion of the Kalam? Nowhere. So you're guilty there of hypocrisy. But rest assured, Olof, mockery, dishonest misrepresentation, and hypocrisy do not an argument make. So that point stands. On the view that the universe is everything that exists, the Kalam fails, and you did nothing to substantively show otherwise. The third segment of your response I want to address is where you took on my argument that entities or facts can be eternal if they have the property of necessary existence. Your counter here failed, Olof, since it was based on a probable misunderstanding and a bare assertion fallacy. It looks like you misunderstood what I meant by finite. It looks like You think I meant finite as in finite temporal duration. That should not have been a misunderstanding on your part if this is the case, since I said finite yet eternal. Obviously, if something is eternal, it does not come into or go out of existence. I meant finite in identity. That which has a finite identity means it has a specific nature, that it exists as something in particular rather than nothing at all or everything ad infinitum. Your response also failed because it was a bare assertion fallacy. You say, quote, that's false. If an entity is necessary in its existence, then it exists in all possible worlds, including the actual world. But if an entity is finite in its existence, then there are possible worlds, including the actual world, where the entity fails to exist. But if it fails to exist in some worlds, then this contradicts the condition for necessary existence, that it exists in all possible worlds, and thus by a reductio ad absurdum, something cannot be finite and yet still be necessary in its existence. Unquote. Nowhere in that blather did you actually substantiate why an entity that is finite in its existence, which, by the way, sounds like you are thinking I mean finite in temporal duration, fails to exist in some possible worlds. You simply asserted without argument on that crucial claim. If you did provide substantiation for that beyond simply asserting it bare, that an entity that is finite does not exist in some possible worlds, including the actual world, let me know. Otherwise, your response on that segment was a bare assertion fallacy. Also, from what I can ascertain, your response was so stupid, it's sheer folly. You claim that if an entity is finite in its existence, then there are possible worlds, including the actual world, where the entity fails to exist. So it looks like you just blundered into refuting your own existence, since you are finite. Yet you claim finite entities fail to exist in the actual world. The actual world is where entities actually exist. So if your mess is true, you don't actually exist. The next segment I wanted to address is where you take on my argument that time does not apply to the universe as a whole. Your response was more folly. First off, you say you're not sure where I got that from. You had just played the segment a few seconds ago where I told you I said on a relational view of time. Then you proceed to try to claim that time does apply to the universe as a whole via the Robertson-Walker metric of Big Bang cosmology. This is utter nonsense, as it has been known for probably a quarter of a century that Big Bang cosmology does not take the whole universe into account, as it's based on general relativity, which applies to the macroscopic. So you can't show time applies to the universe as a whole using the Robertson-Walker metric, since that is based on general relativity. It is sheer folly that you have the nerve to use relativistic cosmology in a way that it has been known for probably over a quarter of a century to be invalid and erroneous to use it as. Time does not apply to the universe as a whole on a relational view of time, and also time does not apply to the universe as a whole via the Wheeler-DeWitt equation. You completely ducked my argument via entity versus event-based view of causality, so that also still stands and is itself alone enough to refute the philosophical arguments for the Kalam. The next segment I want to address is where you attempt to refute my refutation of someone using the Big Bang theory to claim the universe began to exist. You claim what I said there was false. That is completely wrong. What I said there is true. You engaged in dishonesty when you said, paraphrased, that my argument will only be valid if it were the case that all singularity theorems were based on general relativity. That was a dishonest misrepresentation, as I never said all singularity theorems are based on general relativity. So you had no business using that to refute what I said there, or claim that what I said there was predicated on something I never mentioned to begin with. And whether other singularity theorems are based on general relativity or not is completely irrelevant to the long established fact that the Big Bang theory does not show the universe began to exist, as it's based on general relativity, which breaks down at the quantum scale. Next, you try to refute my refutation of the BVG theorem. and you were dishonest there as well. This is because you dishonestly twist what the BVG theorem entails. You claim the BVG theorem and its authors are saying we need quantum cosmology to describe the condition when the universe came into being, since inflation cannot be used. That's dishonest, consistent with the BVG theorem paper itself. You can consult the BVG theorem paper, and the authors tell you the chief result is that inflation alone is not sufficient to provide a complete description of the universe, and some new physics is necessary in order to determine the correct conditions at the boundary. It's not that we need quantum cosmology to describe the condition when the universe came into being, which dishonestly presupposes the very thing in question, but rather that some new physics is necessary in order to determine the correct conditions at the boundary. This boundary is not a beginning of the universe, but rather a beginning of that particular inflationary event. You go on to duck my refutation of the second law of thermodynamics via Craig using it to show the universe began to exist. So that still holds, although in your defense, you ducked it because you say you've never made that argument. But the fact remains that my refutation still holds there. And you ended your video with more insolence and childish mockery via the Jean-Luc Picard facepalm, which was again completely uncalled for and very juvenile and childish given the respectful manner of my video towards you.